The minerals magnesium and calcium do the bulk work as far as extracting the coffee flavors out of the grounds and then putting them into the water, essentially. Those two are the workhorses. The other one is it's called bicarbonate, and that acts as essentially an acid buffer. Coffee is mainly made up of organic acids and some carbohydrates, some proteins, yada yada. And what the buffer does is that it turns the organic acids in the coffee to what's called their conjugate states. And that means that essentially that they're still present in the coffee. We just can't taste them. And it keeps things in balance.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. My guest today is Matt Foster. He is a barista, bartender, owner of the brand coffee, the coffee whiskey brand Sol Luna, and was the 2019 winner of Coffee in Good Spirits competition. I originally connected with Matt during an event for his brand, Sol Luna. More on that in a minute, and he agreed to meet up to talk about all of our favorite beverage we can't imagine living without, coffee. During this conversation, we're going to talk about a whole lot of things. We're going to talk about the ritualistic nature of coffee, how to think about commercial versus fair trade versus specialty coffee, the things you can invest in to make your coffee at home taste better and more flavorful. One of the little things we touch upon that I thought was interesting was how the idea that sometimes the ritual and habit can cause us to do things without necessarily really thinking about it. And what Matt talked about, not that he necessarily had any judgment about this, is that there are moments he might make a high-end specialty coffee for someone and they'll just begin adding coffee and sugar and cream to it before they even taste it. And I think another great example for this is the margarita, which often has the little lime wedge on it. And how often do we just squeeze that lime wedge before we actually see, like, does this margarita actually need any more lime in the first place? When it comes to Matt's coffee whiskey, Sol Luna, part of what he was shooting for when he made this was the idea that coffee wasn't the afterthought. And what Matt means by this is he feels like with a lot of coffee liqueurs out there, and there are some he really enjoys, he feels like you get a slightly more generic coffee flavor, and he wanted something with a lot of depth and nuance. And so with this being a coffee whiskey, when you drink it, you're going to get a lot of bourbon up front, and you're going to get a dry, very nuanced coffee on the back end right there. The one thing Matt closed with that I also thought was interesting to think about on the industry level was he says he thinks it's cool how many relationships have emerged over the years between chefs and bartenders. And he hopes to see more relationships emerge between bartenders and baristas. As Matt said, bartenders have often a big, wide breadth of knowledge, and baristas are often very deep in this one area. And the interplay of knowledge between the two could be very fruitful in terms of helping people get better at their craft and think differently about things. One amendment that Matt wanted to make sure I got correct during our interview, we were talking about what is called Q graders. These are the people who score coffee. They rate the quality of it up front. And he'll get into the nuance of that during our conversation. But Matt said there's several hundred of them out in the across the world, and he emailed me back shortly after being like, I was wrong, it's 8,000. So he just wanted to make sure he did not misrepresent the Q graders out there. You can find Matt online on Instagram at Matt K. Foster on Instagram, or you can find him often here in St. Louis at Century Coffee Company, which is at the Foundry. You can find Sol Luna online at sol.lunacoffeewhiskey.com or at sol.luna.coffeewhiskey on Instagram. That could be a little tricky to type out. There are links to those in the show notes. Enjoy this conversation. So, Matt, what the people at home can't see right now is, we're going to talk obviously about a lot about coffee today. What they can't see is the delicious coffee from China that you brought me that I, of all things, knocked over. You're teeing things up here. So, coffee is something that millions of people, probably even more than that, consume every day, for a lot of us, even multiple times a day, and some of us spend tons of money on coffee and, some of us very little, right? And we've seen the coffee wormhole open up over the past 30 years or so, obviously in part driven by Starbucks initially with the cafe model. And, again, how people feel about it today, that's a whole other thing. When you begin to think about the difference between a well-made cup of coffee and something that might be lacking in flavor or quality, how do you begin to think about that in terms of like when you're beginning to, if you were going to explain to somebody why they might begin to think about investing a little bit more, what are they getting out of a better quality bean? And feel free to run with that in whatever direction you want to head.
No, I love that question. It's very open-ended. So going to the beginning of coffee is divided into a couple of categories, actually. This is kind of the lead up. You have the commercial grade coffee, which is traded on the stock market along with like gold, oil, fruits, stuff like that. And that is what you find for the most part in grocery stores, in gas stations. It's the stuff you can buy a cup for $1 to $3 essentially. And there's not anything wrong with that necessarily. That is where the majority of the world's coffee comes from. But then you have this other world called specialty coffee, and that is the coffee that is so coffee is evaluated on a 100-point scale, and it is evaluated both on a physical level, like when it's harvested and it's dried, and you look at the unroasted green coffee bean, like in Brazil or in Ethiopia, and it's evaluated by these coffee sommeliers, essentially called Q graders. Just some of the most rigorous food and bev testing in the world. Basically, there's not many. There's only like a few hundred of them.
Wow.
Really, and they evaluate it both physically, and then it goes through many levels of tasting by both farmers, Q graders, importers, and then if they score over 80, it's graded as specialty and goes on the specialty market. Anything under 80 goes onto the commercial market, and the commercial market fluctuates as far as the value of coffee, and then how much the farmer makes from their harvest. Commercial grade coffee fluctuates. Again, it's just like any stock market product. Generally, it hangs out at around $3 and some change or so. When it gets bad, that's when fair trade comes in, and that acts as a safety net if the farmers pay to essentially be certified fair trade, they have to pay in order to get that. It's essentially insurance, where if the market price dips below a certain amount, they won't make that bottom of the barrel price. They'll make their fair trade amount, which generally, again, is right around that like $3 a pound mark, which I will say is not always the best or enough. Farmers can still lose money in a year, depending on how the harvest went and labor and the weather and everything. But the specialty market can pay much, much more than that, depending on the coffee and the farmers. And again, it is a very tangled web that we could devote an entire episode to.
Sure.
People have.
Yep.
But so what do people get out of investing in a better cup of coffee. They get more transparency. They get the more assuredness that the farmers in the world that produce this coffee get paid a fair wage. You get a better tasting cup of coffee along with that higher price tag. So yeah, maybe you're paying more than a couple dollars, but you are helping to support an industry that is dedicated to making coffee, not just a commodity, but like a sustainable product for everyone to enjoy, like not just now, but for like generations.
Yeah, I think, it's not lost on us. Yeah, being an agricultural product, and we're not all made infinitely of money. But when you buy tomatoes or whatever from, Walmart, Aldi, whatever, they are coming from a macro-generated farm versus when you buy them from your farmer's market, one, they often taste a lot better. But in addition to that, you were also helping support someone in that regard too. When it comes to flavor, I don't know, depending on, I guess, how large a coffee plantation is per se, if we could be pulling coffee off of that plantation that ranks I don't know, I'm making up numbers, 85 and a 65, whatever the heck the numbers are, doesn't matter.
Sure.
But one that is specialty and one that is not, or two that were like nearby farms. When you begin to think about something that might be the same bean from roughly the same region, but one is pulling into that specialty range beyond the ethics and the labor, what would you think about in terms of looking at one bean that was scoring in that specialty range versus in the commodity range in terms of the flavor we're going to be pulling if we brewed them the exact same way?
Sure. So the bean that would score maybe a 65, for example, it's going to conform to what the market considers coffee flavor, essentially. It's going to be fairly low in acidity, relatively low in sweetness. There'll be some nutty, chocolatey flavors, maybe, but the flavor of the bean then, what typically happens is then whatever roaster gets their hand on that green bean, the flavor will be determined much more by the roasting profile and less from the bean itself.
Okay.
That's another. So specialty coffees, the vast majority of them are going to be roasted on the lighter side, light to light medium, maybe a medium. Because when you roast something dark, you're essentially cooking out the bean's natural flavor qualities, whereas a light roast is going to highlight those flavor qualities, and you can actually taste like the terroir. You can taste where the bean comes from. You can taste the processing method that it went through while it was drying after it's been after the coffee bean has been pushed out of the coffee cherry. There's many different ways that the coffee bean can then be dried and stored that affects its overall flavors and complexities. And so the specialty coffee bean that gets an 85, it's going to have, as long as it's roasted in a proper manner, again, light to maybe a medium, it's going to have the potential to deliver more complex flavors, more like varying levels of acidity, different types of sweetness, maybe a more substantial lingering mouthfeel and finish as well.
And so, I guess that you're right. That is the important thing to point out, is that maybe having a high quality raw material is important, but like this is something that needs to be, it's not ready to be consumed as is. That roasting process, how it's cared for then by that roaster, is also important as well. Okay, yeah, and I feel like that's something I've heard as well. And like, our palates develop over time, but when I was younger, I feel like, before the scales began to tip for me, like I was never like a French roast dark person, but like a medium to dark roast person was probably where I conformed. And then over time have found, that the flavor canon really kind of has opened up as I've kind of been more on that light end of roasts for a long time here.
There's a line of thought in the industry that kind of says that, all of the coffee's potential is locked into the cherry itself once it's picked off of the tree, and then every pair of hands that touches it between the tree and when it is presented to the end customer in brewed form, everyone, there's only chances to take away quality. And so everyone's job, from the farmer to the importer to the roaster to the barista, it's their job to take away as little quality as possible and to preserve what was grown at the origin. And so I kind of followed a similar path, actually. According to my parents, I started drinking coffee when I was around, I think 5 or 6.
Okay.
Just as like an after dinner, I think my mom would let me have like a couple sips of like coffee with a lot of sugar and milk in it, essentially. And then I remember maybe when I was like 9 or 10, I started asking for black coffee and toast to dunk it in. This was back in the early 90s, if I'm going to date myself. And I would just eat the toast, and it was Folgers, right?
Sure.
It was or a dark roast of some kind. And it did take me a while. I had to become a barista and then really start to go through my paces of not just drinking coffee, but actually tasting it. Mm-hmm. Really, like looking for the nuances before I could really appreciate them. And even then, it took a while because coffee is a naturally bitter product, and there is something of a learning curve there. Very, very few of us start out the gate drinking maybe, Scotch neat. We kind of have to work into it, and so we all have our gateway or entryway beverages. I wasn't any different.
Yeah, and I think that is maybe it's a good segue, and we'll carry this wherever it needs to go. But yeah, I think at this point I was also interested to talk about, the person who comes into the shop who is still curious. Hey, I've been a Folgers gas station coffee drinker my whole life. When you think about those gateways that kind of bring people in, where you might start them. Not all of our palates are relative, but when people are curious about that, how do you begin to talk to them about the coffee they're about to experience? Are there formats you like to present it in? What do you do when somebody's interested in specialty coffee to hopefully keep them in our little circle right here?
Yeah. Something to keep them coming back. I generally try to meet everyone where they're at. I'll ask them what they normally get, what they normally enjoy, and what do you feel like drinking right now in this moment. If they come in wanting to experience something different, I'm happy to walk them through something more exotic. But I'm also happy to make them their, for quad shot, almond milk, double caramel iced latte. Happy to do that for them.
Sure.
I want them to enjoy their experience with us as a team, as a cafe. So we're not ever going to judge anyone based on what they feel like drinking and ordering. Now, if they are actively trying to maybe move away from something like that, it's a gradual process. So generally what you do is maybe just get them to try drinking things with less and less milk. So if they've been drinking lattes, 16, 20-ounce lattes, try getting a 12 or an 8-ounce latte, but don't change the amount of espresso. Most places are still only going to be adding 2 shots of espresso to their drinks, and then it's just more milk and sugar on top of it is all. And so just get a different ratio. So if you get a small latte in a specialty shop, chances are it's going to be about 8 ounces. And so then you're going to get about 2 ounces of espresso, and then you'll get about 5 or 6 ounces of steamed milk on top of that with room for the foam, a small amount. And then once they've kind of acclimated to that, you then move them down to a traditional cappuccino, which is a 6-ounce drink that's steamed a little bit more dry. So while it's still about 5.5 or 6 ounces, 2 ounces espresso, 2 ounces steamed milk, 2 ounces of foam, the foam doesn't dilute the espresso. Mm-hmm. So you still get a stronger coffee flavor in that.
Right.
And then from there, you might do a cortado, which is 2 ounces of espresso, 2 ounces of steamed like latte style milk, so not a lot of foam. And then once you go from there, you do a traditional macchiato, which is 2 shots of espresso, and then just a few scoops of just dry foam, so no really any steamed milk. You just get some foam to just kind of like help with the mouthfeel and to just smooth out some of the edges. And then from there, that's where you go on to straight espresso or just straight pour overs and black coffee, really. So I've seen this process happen at shops. I've had regulars that have taken that journey of like whether a regular starts as an iced vanilla latte, and then 6 months later, after essentially we gain their trust and we give them what they want and we walk them through and they trust us to serve them something that they like. I've gotten people from that flavored latte to straight espresso.
Yeah, and they're all delicious. But I would agree, it's that trust, or that, I mean, I have to remind myself of this because I get excited about wanting people to try stuff, and it's like they're giving us money, and like while we're probably confident that what they think they'll like, or that we'll make it right if they don't, that they're afraid they're gonna look dumb, or like, oh, I can't hang, or they just know what they want. And so yeah, I do think that process can happen over time right there.
Coffee is so personal. This is one of the contrasts that I've really noticed spending time as both a barista and a bartender, is that people are maybe just a little less adventurous in their coffee selections than they are maybe in their cocktail selections. When they walk up to a coffee bar, there is a little bit of there is some level of intimidation, maybe if they feel like they don't know how to order. But for the most part, people know how they take their coffee. For the most part.
Yep.
It's a personal ritual for them. It's a comforting thing. I've seen, and again, it's their coffee. They're allowed to do what they want with it. But I've seen people pay a good amount of money for maybe like a really well-made pour over some kind, like a Chemex maybe, and it's not cheap depending on the coffee, right? They'll pay $15 for that cup of coffee because it's so good as it is, because it has these really, really great flavors. And it's their coffee. They can do what they want with it. But almost as just a reflex, without muscle memory, without thinking about it, they will take that expensive cup of coffee and add cream and sugar to it before tasting it, because that's how they're used to taking their coffee.
It's like squeezing a lime reflexively into the margarita, right?
Yeah.
It's like the thing is we haven't even tasted it. It's like salting your fries before you even taste them, right? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's if you are going to spend money on an expensive cup of coffee, you owe it to yourself, really, to try it by itself, see what that experience is like. And if you don't like it, the cream and sugar is right there for you. No problem. Happy to have it there. But I don't necessarily think you would go out and spend like, $200 on a nice bottle of scotch or bourbon, and then the first thing you do with it is throw it into a Jack and Coke or something like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, or you buy like a really expensive steak and the first thing you do is just cover it in A1, right? Like,
right.
Same
thing, yeah.
And for some people they might be, I think you're right. Speaking of how expensive it can be, something I did years ago as I fell into the coffee wormhole and found myself loving going into shops was I was like, okay, like this is fun, but it's not. This does add up over time. And so I leveled up my coffee game at home so that I could hopefully have, if someone, and this could be a progression of thought for you, if they're like, okay, hey, I've been going to see my local Matt for a while now, and we're having a good time, but this is starting to add up right here. I'm willing to invest a little bit of money right now to try to do this at home more affordably, or just save myself the trip. If you're at home, you've got Mr. Coffee and Folgers or whatever, but you enjoy going out. If someone said, hey, I want to invest a little bit of money right now to try to level up my coffee game at home, are there a couple of simple steps you'd recommend? And if it's hard steps, that's fine too. But what way would you start investing money if you were getting into the coffee drinking process at home?
So two major things I would say is where I would tell people to focus first. The number one thing actually is the water that they use. Drip coffee is 99 to 98% water. And so if you don't have like good filtered obviously, like neutral smelling, completely clear water, your coffee is not going to taste right.
Okay.
Essentially. And I mean, we could go into water science. I mean, we're pretty fortunate here in St. Louis. I feel we have pretty good tap water. I would still recommend, just getting a normal, just like a Brita filter or something, just some kind of water filter, just to get out the excess, essentially minerals. Just to nerd out a little bit. The minerals magnesium and calcium do the bulk work as far as extracting the coffee flavors out of the grounds and then putting them into the water, essentially. Those two are the workhorses. The other one is it's called bicarbonate, and that acts as essentially an acid buffer. Coffee is mainly made up of organic acids and some carbohydrates, some proteins, yada yada. And what the buffer does is that it turns the organic acids in the coffee to what's called their conjugate states. And that means that essentially that they're still present in the coffee. We just can't taste them. And it keeps things in balance, essentially. Keeping things like the amount of calcium in your water to a reasonable amount, which I admit you cannot do with like a regular, just normal water filter. You need a more specialized thing. Helps control lime scale. So like if you have an espresso machine at home, invest in a quality water filter, because then you won't have lime scale build up as quickly in your machine, and it's going to extend the lifespan of your machine. Your coffee quality is going to improve. The flavor clarity is going to improve. So yeah, water is incredibly important. So that's the first place. The second place I would say is the grinder, because brewing good coffee often boils down to, no pun intended, you don't boil coffee, unless we're talking percolators. Sorry, tangent. Controlling the variables of extraction. How quickly, how much are we taking from the coffee grounds and putting it into the water, essentially. And the particle size of your coffee grounds, how big and small, your grounds are, that plays such a huge part. And you kind of want a bell curve. Like when you have a coffee grinder that you can adjust the dial on, where like typically, small numbers, one means a finer grind, so something you would want for like a Turkish coffee or an espresso. Larger numbers, more coarse, so what you would want for like a French press or a cold brew. And then numbers in the middle, let's say, 1 through 10, so a 5, you're looking at like your coffee machines. You want a bell curve, or at least that's, or as uniform as possible. If you have your coffee machine set on a 5, you want as many of those coffee grounds to be that setting. You don't want a lot of what we call boulders, so particles that are much, much larger, and you don't want a lot of dust. You don't want a lot of those really, really fine coffee grounds, because that's going to affect your overall extraction, brewing, and therefore the flavor quality of your coffee. So being able to control that particle size by purchasing a burr grinder, essentially, or a conical grinder, something that isn't essentially spinning blades,
right,
which are more meant for spices and everything else. Investing in a good grinder that will grind your coffee consistently, can do it in a good amount of time, so it doesn't generate a lot of heat from the friction, which can also have an effect. Would be the number 2 thing I would invest in if you're really looking to up your coffee game. If you're going to go out and buy that $30 bag of coffee for yourself at home, good water, a good grinder, you're going to that's the way to protect your investment, essentially, because the quality as far as like brewers go, they're, unless you're talking about, like the $30 coffee machine versus like the $200 coffee machine, unless you're talking about that kind of comparison, the quality variance between brewers, if they're within the same category, same price range, that variance is much, much smaller than like the quality of grinder you can get, or if your water's bad.
First, conversations about magnesium and calcium and bicarbonate. That is the reason why I do this freaking podcast, everybody. This is the meat of the thing. But I also remember years ago, I remember reading, I think this when they were still independent, but like some like roaster Blue Bottle was basically saying, he was like, someone was asking him about better coffee. He goes, the first step is to get a grinder. The second step is to get a good grinder. And so, yeah,
You're not wrong.
Yeah. And so I think like, so one, good water, check. And then the idea is, so Matt, clearly better roasted coffee is going to, pardon me, everybody. So better roasted coffee and then ground is going to be great. But before I might even, so right now I'm drinking pre-ground coffee at home.
Sure.
And it's Starbucks, doesn't matter, whatever, And they also have their whole bean in the same of their, they've got their Pike's Place ground and they've got their Pike's Place whole bean right there.
Yep.
Now, even just taking something that is whole bean and then grinding that in a good grinder, immediately we're going to have better flavor because the flavor is not going to be able to escape for as long, right? So even if we were to convert from there, we can, of course, level up the caliber of the coffee we're buying. But is that comparison I'm drawing fair, that if I was to have the same coffee pre-ground versus grind it myself that day, am I going to be pulling better flavor at that point in time?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Grinding yourself is always going to be preferable to either buying it pre-ground from the roaster. Even a lot of coffee roasters will sell pre-grounded coffee. It's fine. Or even buying your coffee at a coffee shop and then having them grind it there in the cafe for you,
Yep.
and then you taking it home and then finishing it off in even like a week or something like that, right?
Yep.
Essentially, if we're looking for, this is like the ideal experience, right? Like coffee starts to degas like immediately, essentially. After it leaves the coffee roaster, it gives off a lot of CO2. It gives off a lot of nitrogen. That's why you see these little air filters in the coffee bags. When you buy them, it's a one-way valve that lets the coffee degas. It lets air escape, but it doesn't let any air in. Mm-hmm. And that's because most of the flavor from the coffee beans comes from the oils that the roasting process will turn a lot of the material in the it goes through Maillard reactions where it highlights the organic acids, creates a lot of carbohydrates in it, and the oils are kind of what that's where they're stored for the most part. Not all of them, but most of it. So if the oils evaporate, most of the flavor is then gone as well, or at least, again, the complexity of it. You'll have coffee that has been pre-ground and just left to sit out for a long time is going to taste less complex. It's going to taste more flat, more uniform, which, again, if that's what people are looking for, if that's what they're used to, no judgment. That is that they can drink their coffee how they want to. But if you ever go to a professional coffee cupping, you'll see them grind coffee there on site, and I'm going to try to set this table for you. So imagine a table, like a dinner table, if not, a large dinner table, let's say, and then we would have like maybe, up to 20 different coffees around the table, and they're in these little 6-ounce cups. Each coffee though has like 5 cups though. So one coffee, 5 cups, that 20 times around the table. And they do that essentially because in each cup, there's only about 10 grams of ground roasted coffee to sample that coffee. And so they do 5 cups of that same coffee because it's a random sample. And it's essentially both to give it a fair chance, because if there's just one off bean in that 10 gram sample, it would throw off the entire cup. So it's giving it a fair shot, but we're also looking for consistency. So if we want to make sure that like all 5 of those cups, or maybe 4 out of the 5, if one got something wrong with it, that those 4 or 5 taste the same. essentially. And so they'll grind all those coffees, and they will go around the table, the Q graders, the buyers, the importers, and they'll smell the dry coffee grounds. It's called the fragrance. But then they will then add the water to start brewing them, not in like an hour later or like 4 hours. Like they're not grinding coffee in the morning to be cupped in the afternoon. They'll do it in like 10 minutes, like maximum like 30 minutes later. Because as soon as you grind your coffee, you start losing all of those complexities.
Sure.
So the sooner you can start brewing it, the less oils will have evaporated and the more flavor is going to be sealed in your cup.
Got it. It's helpful. Okay, so while this is a cocktail podcast, we are here, and I'm staring at the bottle right now. So you talked about certainly the marriage of your, morning work and night work of barista and bartender right here. We are not, you and I were talking beforehand about the idea that, when we're talking about coffee flavored products, certainly we could get into, the Kahluas and Mr. Blacks and whatnot of the world. But talk to us about, obviously there was a love for this here, but how did you end up on this path for Sol Luna of kind of having this coffee whiskey right here? Talk to us about the product, the origin. Tell us a little bit about it. We'll talk about cocktails, your love of it, but kind of set the stage for us on how this bottle ended up being here.
Yeah. So it's kind of the culmination of my accumulated time as a barista and a bartender. I've always loved making tasty things for people. I wanted to, so I'll go back. Some of my best memories have come from spending time with both coworkers and guests over a cup of coffee or over a cocktail, whether we're sitting at a table or if I'm on one side of the bar and they're on the other side. And Sol Luna came about by me wanting to really be to not only be like a facilitator of those experiences, but to help be a producer of them, if that makes sense as
Sure.
a delineation. I wanted to make a product that really spoke towards that experience of bringing people together, which coffee shops are famous for, being a place for community. Bars are another type of community gathering spot, maybe a just a step to like the side of coffee shops. Same idea. And so after I had won the U.S. Coffee and Good Spirits Championship in 2019, being able to travel to Berlin for the World Championships. I was able to meet some amazing baristas and bartenders over there. I was able to taste a lot of different spirits over there that just you can't find over here, and I wanted to create something unique over here as well, something that wasn't available yet. And during my time behind the bar, I had made my own coffee infusions, coffee spirits in small batches that I would use in the bar, because so many of the out of the bottle products I would find easily accessible, at least in my market. It was always a sweetener. Coffee was always used as either a sweetening agent or the coffee flavor itself was kind of an afterthought. It was just a uniform, very broad stroke coffee flavor. And I just got it into my head like, hey, I bet I could make something really unique. And so I put my mind to really trying to create a product that I would want to use behind the bar, that I could serve by itself, that could be versatile in cocktails, that would help serve both my guests and my fellow industry people as well. So I had reached out to a whiskey distillery here in St. Louis, Switchgrass Spirits. Sure. I'd gotten to know them not too long after I had helped open the annex in Webster Groves. And so I took my team there on a tour of their distillery. And afterwards, I kind of hung back and I just kind of pitched this idea at them and asked if they would be interested in helping me create my product. And they were. Two out of the three owners had actually spent time as baristas in the past, and so they knew that they knew just enough that they didn't know enough to invest the time in doing enough R&D and research to create a product that they would want to do. And so they were very intrigued by me just coming to them and asking like, hey, like I've got an idea and like I think I've got a really good recipe, like could I maybe use your bourbon as a base for my spirit? And so like fast forward 2 years later or so, after creating the business entity of Soluna and going through the regulations of the alcohol industry, and learning that, I released it in October of 2023 to the St. Louis market, and I couldn't be happier about it. It really was a journey to go from like a barista, bartender, general manager role to owning an alcohol brand. Sure. and business. And so that by itself was very, very exciting, and just really happy to be able to share it with everyone.
Cool. So a couple of things. One, I'd love to hear whatever degree of okay, you've got, switchgrass goes to trouble to produce their great bourbon for you. I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about whatever degree you're comfortable with, like what's the process of arriving at Soluna from that. And to your point of like with some of the products, you said earlier, like, Mr. Black, a coffee liqueur is something you really, really enjoy, but help us kind of, whether it's Mr. Black or something else, if someone's like, so what's the difference between the two? Because you kind of talked me through it, but I'd love to hear a little bit about when people think of their coffee liqueurs that they're using for espresso martinis or whatever, how should they think about it? Because this is different. So talk to us about the difference between that and a lot of the coffee liqueurs on the market.
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of a lot of the, like Mr. Black, of the other coffee products out there, but I would say the marketed difference in my product is that it's not sweet, it's dry. It can be used to be it can be sipped by itself neat on a cube, and it's great. That's what I wanted, because it tastes like coffee and it tastes like bourbon. I use minimal sugar. I use just enough to kind of smooth out the edges I use a cold brew concentrate to proof down the bourbon straight out of the barrel, essentially. So it's 25 ABV. You get the bourbon flavors up front, so think like vanilla and malt flavors. The coffee is going to come in towards the middle as like a dark chocolate flavor. It's going to kind of persist throughout the drinking experience. But then on the end, it really dries up, and you get more baking spices and toffee flavors that linger.
Okay.
And that comes from the choice of the coffee, the choice to not water down my cold brew, essentially, and the quality of spirit that Switchgrass produces, as well as I use whole star anise in the mix in the blending tank at the end, just a very quick, fast infusion, so you don't get so much of the flavors of the star anise, but again, just the drying effect of it. And so when you sip it by itself, you can, it can appeal to bourbon drinkers because it tastes like a bourbon up front. But then the coffee nuances come through afterwards, where instead of getting just a generic coffee flavor, you're going to get the complexities of some of the baking spices. You're going to get like the dark chocolates, some of the toffees. You're going to get a hint of acidity, it's a really complex spirit that brings more to the table, and therefore your cocktails as well, where you can choose to add this to a cocktail and then still use another type of sweetener like agave or a 2-to-1 brown sugar or anything you like. You can still play with the sweetness level of your cocktail without it being too much, because my product really isn't adding it. It's just adding a complexity of the malt, some wood, again some chocolate, some spices, and it's so it makes it a really versatile product that can be enjoyed by itself and can be used as a base even for a lot of classic cocktails instead of just being a sweetening agent of it. Yeah.
Are you so I guess based on that implement, to use dive into the weeds on that a little bit, are you using it more like, or have you found it useful in applications as like split base, or go straight in like 2 ounces, or how have you what are some ways you have seen it employed that you've enjoyed or that you've crafted yourself? If you were going to like tear somebody loose on 1 or 2 like surefire ways to start with it, how would you begin to play with this bad boy right here?
I mean, the easiest thing is to just use it as a base spirit for a classic whiskey cocktail. So like a Boulevardier is one of my favorites. Okay. Where you just I do use more of the coffee whiskey. So I might use like 1.5 ounces of Saluna, and then 3/4 ounce of a sweet vermouth, and then 3/4 of an ounce of like a red Italian aperitif, like a Campari or whatever you like. And then just stir it and then serve it neat or over ice. And you have this wonderfully like bittersweet, slightly spiced, slightly chocolatey, classic, like velvety, silky smooth cocktail to enjoy. Similarly, I've seen people use it as a base in a Manhattan, whether like a cold brew Manhattan or a black Manhattan. Again, with just some sweet vermouth and some bitters. I've seen a couple bars use a recipe like that here in town. Yep. It also works great in something like a Kentucky Mule, where you add just like a hint of lime. Coffee loves acidity. If you use it in the right amounts, adding just like a touch of lime to this really, really brings it alive.
That's interesting.
Because the coffee acidities are still in there. Yeah. And so it just highlights them. And then you top it with ginger beer. So again, it bolsters some of the baking spices with the ginger spiciness, and it's fantastic. Throw it in a mug, in a copper mug with like a lime and maybe a mint sprig on top. It is fantastic. It's chocolatey, subtly sweet and spicy.
I'll tell you what, the Boulevardier sounds like a great plan. I'll have to try it, but I am all here for a mule. It's typically not something I just order.
Sure.
But the minute you said it, I was like, oh, that would be good. So yeah. Huh.
Because the cold brew is concentrated in there, if you add equal parts hot water to this, so maybe 2 ounces of this, 2 ounces hot water, maybe a touch of honey or brown sugar to it to sweeten it up, float some cream on top, you have an Irish coffee.
Sure. Without
the need to keep hot coffee ready behind the bar.
Sure.
And the coffee flavor is still completely there. And because it's bourbon, you can use this as a more complex base for an espresso martini. It'll foam up great because, again, the cold brew is still concentrated, still there, and so you can add vodka if you want to up the proof a little bit more. But really, again, like all you might want is just like a touch more sweetener. Use simple syrup, brown sugar maybe. Add maybe like a half ounce to an ounce of like a half and half or heavy cream. Shake it up, and you've got a fantastic espresso martini drink.
Yeah, so in general, so you say you're 25% ABV, is that right?
Correct.
On this guy, yeah.
Correct.
So yeah, there could be moments where, depending on how somebody's playing, they might want to bump the proof or something like that, depending on things. But to your point, yeah, you just leveled up, like with your Boulevardier, you just went heavier on the pour of Soluna right there. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's fun in terms of it interesting, like to your point, a more versatile way to play with that as opposed to as like a modifier to kind of like lead with it in that regard. Okay, cool. I mean, we have certainly covered the rounds on coffee a bit right here. Is there anything regarding the product or coffee that we haven't touched on so far that you would find useful at this point?
I really hope that the relationship between baristas, bartenders, can really start expanding. I remember when I was heavy in my barista time and starting to dabble in bartending. That was about 8 years ago now. I've been a barista for about 16 or 17 years now. I've been a bartender, mixologist for about half that time, so about 8 years. Bartenders and chefs started to have this really like close relationships.
Yep.
As again, cocktails were more culinary, more artisan. I was so happy to see that, and we've started to see maybe some of that, so some more crossover of bartenders talking to baristas. Liqueur 43 thank you, has their fantastic like barista bartender challenge every year, where the challenge to create a great cocktail with their Spanish orange spiced liqueur, and it's great. I helped to organize after winning the U.S. Coffee and Good Spirits competition. I've since helped organize them around the country, where we invite as many of the best bartenders and baristas to come and compete in the competition to make these amazing craft hot and cold coffee cocktails. The next national competition actually is going to be the weekend of February 22nd through the 23rd.
Okay.
Well, it starts on Friday, so I think that might be that. So I think that the 22nd is Friday, February 20th.
I know Saturday of February is the 1st. So, yeah, I guess that's like whatever that is. That's the 22nd. Yeah, anyway. So, yeah, anyway. I think, that weekend.
Yeah, it'll be this year's national competition is set for that weekend of February 22nd in Durham, North Carolina.
Okay.
So if any bartenders or baristas are in that part of the country listening, I highly recommend checking us out. It's being held at the Fruit event venue.
Okay.
Because I just think there's a lot to gain from bartenders maybe showing baristas how to infuse flavors into syrups, how to maybe balance a coffee drink. But, because balancing a cocktail is a little bit different from like dialing in a shot of espresso.
Yep.
And honestly, I think bartenders could learn from honestly like the level of concentration and details that baristas have when they're trying to learn how to best do a pour over, dial in their espresso each morning. The way I kind of look at it is that bartenders have this really wide breadth of knowledge where they have to know so many classic cocktail builds. They have to be familiar with all the brands and bottles on the back bar, right? Whereas baristas tend to go maybe more deep, where they learn about they just have their like coffee, and maybe they have an equal knowledge of their tea that they have behind their counters as well. But they spend all the time learning about the roast profiles, where the coffee comes from, and the farms, the processing. They go really, really deep into that, and so I just think that there's a chance for each professional to learn from the other's strengths.
Yep.
Essentially. So I hope that the competitions, the conversations that are happening more and more now, thankfully, that we can help support each other, where, bartenders are going to like their favorite coffee shops in the morning, and baristas are going to like those those cocktail bars in the evenings.
I mean, I think like it certainly makes sense that there's a lot of sharing there. And for me as well, I think I spend just a lot of time thinking about like yes, you need a well-made cup of coffee. But like a well-made cup of coffee is great. A well-made cocktail, thoughtfully poured glass of wine is great. But for me, I spend a lot of time thinking more and more the third space, the community aspect of it. And like there are times you're getting killed in the morning rush or Friday night at 8 p.m. in a bar where there's less of the chance for that. But I just think the number of people who come to either place that would be interested to learn more, to be pulled deeper into that world is more than people think. And I think that for bartenders to study how is community built at certain coffee shops or not built and vice versa, I think is valuable in terms of thinking about like what makes this the kind of place where like I can get good coffee here or 3 blocks over. What makes me want to come to this place? And so often I think it's the vibe, it's the people. And I think it's just another X factor that we all have to consider as the standards rise. What does it take to be the kind of place that people want to spend their time?
No, that's a really good point and thought that you can, especially this day and age, you can get a decent cup of coffee, like especially in places like that Chicago, Manhattan, where there's a coffee shop on every other block. So yeah, what makes you choose your spot? Why do you keep going back to the same place? And you can balance things like, oh well, I like the breakfast burrito at this place, or it is maybe just literally that many steps closer from your front door, and so that's the one you go to. But to your point, I do think that the relationships that are developed, having your regulars, people are so much more likely to share a negative experience with their friends than they are a good experience, I found. And so being able to maintain that good relationship with people is such can be built on that one time interaction, that one time that person chooses your spot. And so what kind of experience do they have in your place that makes them feel maybe just that much more welcomed, special?
Yep.
To make them become your regular, that through no other reason than they like talking with the barista or the bartender, essentially, right? Customer service, guest service. I think for those of us maybe in the industry, at times I think it is something that we not take for granted, but is something that I think we only think about when we're training someone new and they're new to helping people through what we just talked about earlier. Talking someone through, well, like, do you want an iced vanilla soy latte, or are you after like a shot of espresso, or again, if someone's used to going to a Starbucks and ordering a macchiato and getting a very large coffee drink, and then coming into a specialty coffee shop, and all of a sudden they're served this 2 ounces of espresso with a little dollop of foam on top, and walking them through that. Some of us who have been in the industry so long, I think it's something we innately enjoy and don't think about that much. It's just built into our muscle memory at some point, maybe. But then we see someone that isn't there yet, and then we have to help them along so that the culture and the atmosphere of the place stays the same over the years, which I think is the true test. So that people can keep choosing your cafe, your bar, and can keep coming back for that experience.
Yeah, and I think too that in the world of that often does trumpet newness. Look at this place that just opened or whatever. I think the question is what are those things that keep people coming back? And certainly new ingredients, whatever. But there's a line that I'm going to borrow from this, like, it's a Guatemalan bartender who works in Mexico, but he said, hospitality is the art of making people forget the concept of time. And I think, it's this idea, but what it takes for that to happen is so little. But it unfortunately requires us, even when we're busy, to pay attention to what's the little thing you notice about someone or they say or you can do. But it kind of does that. Anyways, now this is turning into a whole other like therapy release for me. But yeah, I think like it's cool when you have those moments, and I think we just need to spend a little more time thinking about how do we cultivate them in each of our spaces, despite the fact that we are busy, because I think it can be one of the big moments that can kind of make or break a place too at times.
No, there is very in a similar vein. There is a line of thought in our industry that the cup of coffee is only as good as the experience that it's served with, essentially. And so, I think making sure that we don't lose focus from even when it's busy, to make sure that the guests feel taken care of, and that they're the priority. Is super important. I often tell my teams that even when we're busy and there's a million things to like do, and we've got a line, you need work with a sense of urgency, not impatience, and to, the people come first, and the dishes they will get done. With the coffee spill over there, unless it's like dripping onto the floor and in front of someone, like it will get wiped up. Help the people in the immediate, and then you can go back to organizing the shelves. You can go back to dusting off the counters and everything else. And in an ideal world, all that would happen simultaneously, because you have enough people to make sure you keep a tidy cafe and guest service. But sometimes choices have to be made, and the guest should always be that first choice.
Right. Or you can be like me and spill the coffee on the carpet and it cleans itself up. So yeah.
I can't even see it anymore.
Matt, this is great. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It was great being here.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd write us a review on whatever platform you listen on, or share an episode with a friend. The show notes are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. Happy cocktailing, everybody.